did by sorry. I was reading some books, right? I got some more. I'll probably just go over some of them. I'm tired right now. I finished this one. This one's called Chosen Peoples, Sacred Sources of National Identity by Anthony Smith, right? It was pretty good. I like how I went over the histories of like all the other Christian nations. It goes over like the Anglos, the Slavs, and they all like seem to presuppose like the covenant spirituality or the covenant worldview, right? So it's pretty much standard, right? Like as far as Christian nations, how to make sense of them. And also like, because it comes from the ancient Israel spirituality or so. It then goes over like the Third Rome ideology, right? Like right here. And that's basically Russian nationalism. Just going over like all the history of it, right? And then trying to remember. Sorry, I'm tired. I'm just trying to recall the stuff I read. Let me see. What do I remember about this one? Just remember thinking like. Let me see. I guess I'll just take time to read some of it right now. This is the popular basis of Holy Russia in song and legend suggested a growing divorce between the accepted Muscovite political concept of Russia and the sacred, even transcendental quality of the Russian land and the people as the land of true Christendom. However, at this juncture, the myth of Holy Russia was still constrained by popular acceptance of a righteous Tsar, and hence a dynastic myth of election, which attaches the realm and the people to the person and institution of the Tsar. In this respect, it resembles the Ethiopian royal myth more than the ancient Israelite communal ideal, but it was also equally an ecclesiastical myth, though not a covenantal one like the Armenian. The Russian Orthodox Church occupied a special place for it, had a divinely ordained mission, and it was to preserve the pure Christian faith as expressed in and through the church that the Muscovite Tsars were called to their God-given throne. That is why we must, after all, take the Byzantine connection and the doctrine of the Third Rome seriously, if not directly in political terms, then certainly in religious and increasingly in national cultural terms. It is every bit and as important as the search for the legitimation of the Muscovite grand princes by tracing their lineage to the early Kievan rulers and lands, for wherever Kievan Rus had been little more than a loose confederation of princes and nobles, the Muscovite rulers treated their lands and subjects as personal property, and hence needed a theory of absolute God-given rule, which could really be derived only from Byzantium, though one nobleman, Ivan Persvetov, did offer an alternative vision of a secularized Russian state, which owed more to an analysis of the source of the success of the Ottoman Empire than of Byzantium. But Vitov's was a lone voice. The Byzantine dream offered an Orthodox Russian Tsar greater scope and a deeper bond with his people. To this end, a Russian Tsar required a powerful but subordinate and supportive church. But it was not to be, though the Russian Church, and with it the concept of Holy Russia, reached its zenith in the early 17th century. The bastion of orthodoxy was soon revealed to be in decay. It had variable and unintelligible ritual practices and comparative lack of clerical education and scholarship, and many textual errors in its sacred books. Reforms were desperately needed, and they were supplied by the provincial zealots of piety, who included the zealous Nikon. After transferring to Moscow, Nikon would become patriarch in 1652 under the most pious of the Tsars, Alexei Romanov, but the concord between the Tsar and his dictatorial patriarch soon faded, and Nikon was condemned and deposed in 1667 by a church council, and so were his old believers' opponents, including the archpriest Avekum. Those who wished to retain the old Muscovite rituals and beliefs regulated by Ivan the Fourth's councils. Looking back, many came to see in the Great Schism and the subsequent massacre of many old believers in 1682 the end of the old organic and holy Russia. Then it goes on to talk about France and England and all these other, Scotland, all these other, biblically conscious people. And then, I guess they add on to that, the Constantinianism or whatever, that kind of stuff. So predominantly it's tied to old covenant spirituality, or the covenant spirituality, basically, because Christians are new covenant people and they share in that history, right? And with the old covenant Israelites and their God and stuff like that, right? They share in their destiny because of that, the God of Christ. And America, has this as well, the covenantal spirituality. As I was reading this other book. This one's called The American Mind. It's America's True and Lasting Character by Richard Stubbe. And I have this book for a couple of years, just haven't read it, right? And it quotes John Quincy Adams, right? He's the 6th president, I think, and then he's the son of John Adams, and he is quoted here. So this is what he says. Let me see. Well, in this chapter, it says, sorry, or was it? That's right here. It says the Declaration of Independence is like a biblical memorial set for remembrance for generations to come. John Quincy Adams declared even more fervently. He says, fellow citizens, the Ark of your covenant is the Declaration of Independence. He says this in John Quincy Adams 119, right? Trying to look for the footnote, but I looked up the quote, and he says other things, right? But it's tied to their covenant spirituality. And this is during the Republic, right? And it goes on. The book talks about the Ark of the Covenant was an ornate vessel prescribed by God and built by the Israelites. It held to the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna from the Israelite 40-year wandering in the desert, and the staff of Aaron, through whom God established the priesthood of the Israelites. On the lid of the ark was the mercy seat, from which God met with Moses to give him commands for the Israelite people. And this remarkable metaphor by John Quincy Adams exhibits the understanding of the Declaration of Independence as being the mechanism by which American government could fulfill its godly purpose and liberty. It was built to espouse the laws of God, to show God's blessings on men, like the providing of manna, and to define God's guidance as the source of righteousness, righteous governance. Like biblical memorials, the ideas and principles for which the Declaration of Independence stands are good and timeless, regardless of subsequent failures or to righteously address them. For this reason, some would have the Declaration forgotten and the Constitution raised as the banner of American culture. They want to be able to ignore that. They want to be able to ignore or change the righteous vision of America's founding. The Constitution is to be hailed as the plan that has enabled America to weather many storms, but it could not have been and likely would not have lasted without the vision memorialized in the American Declaration of Independence, the American mind. It just goes on to talk about that, but yeah, because I just want to also highlight that quote, right? Because I forgot what other, because I looked it up on the chat, right? I forgot what else he said, but it's basically like, I don't know, typology or covenant spirituality, like I said, right? And yeah, it shows that, remember, like I was like saying in my other videos, that's one way you could see the American Declaration, right? And the Constitution, and like together, right? Like together they give you that American covenant thing. Like the American Declaration, the moral, covenantal, sacred oath, and then the Constitution is like the legal foundation of it, or the legal aspects of it, or so, right? Then the federalism, like the federalism's like the covenantal stewardship, right? And then as far as like who the God of the Declaration is, I mean, they pretty much is, like in this book, like I read this one, it's kind of like a little dry, but it's technical. It's called The American Constitutional Tradition. It goes over the colonial charters, covenants, and revolutionary state constitutions, right, since the Pilgrims and stuff. It's pretty much the prototype American with their covenantalism, constitutionalism, and yeah, they're like the prototype federalism. That their federalism comes from these people, and it's really them, I believe, who names the God, right? The God of Christ, and then it evolves into a more enlightened form with Jefferson and a Declaration. Gears in fashioning its procedure, Massachusetts established the president both for the calling of a special constitutional convention of 1787 and for the process by which the Constitution was ratified by the states. The Massachusetts approach also gave concrete recognition to Constitution writing as being in all respects distinct from ordinary legislation, and to constitutional law as being the immutable principles upon which the government was founded and individual rights and liberties were secured against encroachment by that government. The revolutionary state constitutions created centralized representative governments that were discrete from town or country governments or county governments, whose authority was supreme within their own spheres. The state constitution writers drew upon the learning and experience that had grown out of the colonial charters and covenants spanning more than 2 centuries. The delegates later carried with them this colonial experience when the Federal Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. Their experiences coalesced in their deliberations at the Philadelphia Convention and in the ratifying proceedings in the states. Thus, it was that this American constitutional tradition found its most lasting expression in a new federal constitution. And then this other book similar to this one. So it's from The Origins of American Constitutionalism, Donald Lutz. It goes over all he keeps the Pilgrim covenantal order and their constitutionalism, all that as American or early constitutionalism. and federal principles or so. Like, it keeps that intact instead of doing what liberal secularists do, right? They try to cut off the roots, the colonial roots or the pilgrim roots of the republic, right? And they think it's a radical departure from that, but it's not. I see it as more of an evolved form from that, or upon that kind of structure or foundation. So they operate within it, right? And then and this one, and I read this one a while back. I like this book, right? The Founders in the Bible by Carl Richards, right? It's like this one. It's like that, I mean. And here you see where Jefferson, right, in this, because I've read from this before, right, the second anarchical address from 1805 by Jefferson, right, when he's addressing the nation. It's pretty much like you clearly see the covenantal spirituality still intact here, just like I showed you in John Quincy Adams's quotes, right? And here Jefferson says that I shall need the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our forefathers as his rule of old from their native land and planted them in the land flowing with all the necessities and comforts of life, who has covered our infancy with his providence and our ripper years with his wisdom and power, and to whose goodness I ask you to join me in supplications that he will so enlighten the minds of your servants, guide their counsels and prosper their measures, and that whosoever they shall do shall result in your good and secure the peace, friendship, and approbation of all nations, end quote. And then, yeah, because this shows that he appeals to the same God of the pilgrims, right, as the pilgrims did. And the other Christian nations that I show you, they always like predicate themselves on the covenantal worldview, because Christians are a new covenant people. And so to me, he is just building upon what's already established, right? Like, he does not invent, like Jefferson does not invent the God of 1776 or the idea of liberty, because you can find it from its religious sources, right? Which is in the Pilgrims and in their tradition, where they got it from in the scriptures and the Anglo-Protestant tradition, right? Because they come from like Britain, I think, right? So I'm just tired. And I was reading this one as well, right? Christian Nation with a question mark. The United States in Popular Perception and Historical Reality by T. Adams, Upchurch. Might read a little bit from it. Like in this chapter, right? I'll just read it a little bit. It says the American irrationalism. The founders and the reasonableness of religion. It says the Declaration of Irrationalism. Having established a basis for understanding free thinking among the founders, an inquiry into how they put their free thought to use in creating the United States government is now in order. If free thinking did not lead to an atheism in most cases, but rather to differing views of who or what the monogod was, the founders, it can be concluded with certainty, that did not leave this god of theirs out of the nation's governmental charters. Although modern secularists contend that the founders were motivated merely by a secular philosophy of natural law and natural rights, the fact is that most of the founders did not believe this system of nature operated without the guidance of a deity. Quote, it was the founding fathers' faith in the reality of the higher law that enabled them to speak so confidently of these self-evident truths which they accepted as axioms. What God had given, God could take away, but divine gifts were not to be taken away by one's fellow man, end quote. Two examples of men in the founding generation who held this view are Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Langdon. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson called the deity nature's God and then used synonymous creator, judge, providence. This deity was not nature itself, was not nature itself, but the one who ruled over nature, as evidenced by the wording he used, quote, nature and nature's God, end quote. This deity could be prayed to, and an answer could be expected, as long as the things prayed for were not self-serving, asking for a blessing, for instance, upon the new United States, a nation founded with the intention of having a positive impact upon all mankind, would be considered an acceptable prayer. So it'd be approved of, right? And talks about some American loyalist named Samuel Langdon said during the Revolution, quote, "Thanks be to God that He has given us as men natural rights independent of all human laws, or whatever. By the law of nature, any body of people may form themselves into a civil society," end quote. This statement indicates that Langdon believed in God and nature as two separate entities, with the former controlling the latter. The confusion over the question of whether the founders viewed God and nature as one and the same comes most directly from the words of John Locke, who wrote such things as the Creator made man to be a social creature, and thus it is ingrained in man, quote, to enter into society by a certain propensity of nature, end quote. In this phraseology, God designed man to obey nature, thus making man subservient to both nature and God. If subservient to both, does that not make nature a type of lord over man as well? So it would seem today it is understood that genetic coding is what gives man most of his natural propensities. When people say colloquially nowadays that it is in someone's nature to be a certain way, they mean it is in his or her genetic composition. Locke certainly meant the same thing, but lacked the scientific knowledge of genetics to explain it in anything other than the most primitive, rudimentary terms. And then says down here says, this is according to talks about Locke, and it says this idea seemed to the founder self-evident. Here we go. It says, moreover, to be perfectly clear and precise about this issue, Locke's words must be used in a political rather than metaphysical or abstract philosophical context. By doing so, it can reasonably be concluded that Locke intended, just as Jefferson and most of the founders interpreted, that a hierarchy existed in the universe that flowed from top down in this order: God, nature, and mankind, government, with each the creator of, and thus the one in control of, the one directly beneath it. This idea had enormous consequences for the founders, who realized, as Locke had a century earlier, that mankind and government had gone backwards in relation to one another and other nations through monarchies and their despotic political systems. The job of the United States, therefore, was to correct this imbalance and put man back in charge of government, in other words, or to put government to work for the good of man rather than government lording over man. This idea seemed to the founders, quote, as self-evident, end quote. When Jefferson and the other founders applied this rationale to the new American man and government relationship, they did so with the understanding that unless they declared clearly and forcefully that man's rights are, quote, unalienable, end quote, because they come from nature rather than government, someone someday would surely get this hierarchy out of order again and use government to try to take away man's natural rights. According to this interpretation, the wording of the Declaration of Independence begins to take on a new meaning and make better sense. When Jefferson wrote that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights, he meant that government are instituted by men to ensure that the laws of nature are followed, which are in turn subject to the will of the unseeable, unknowable Creator. The Creator, who is otherwise hidden from man, is revealed in the creation, nature, and in order to make certain that all mankind gets the opportunity to appreciate the Creator through the creation. Governments must keep the peace between individuals and nations, but otherwise not interfere with the hierarchy. Without government, every man would be a law unto himself. Hence, the hierarchy in reverse works like this. Government protects man's rights to observe nature and thereby observe the Creator through that Creator's handiwork called nature. Thus, the formation of the United States of America was for the purpose of protecting and enforcing the will of an unseeable, unknowable entity. Yet if this interpretation is correct, it must be concluded that the Declaration, which is generally seen as an almost exclusively rationalist document, contains a strong strain of the religious, the mystical, and or the metaphysical. Although this interpretation of the Declaration makes it appear quite irrational, and at first glance that would seem strange, and actually should not be thought unusual, when scrutinizing carefully the ideology that is called rationalism, during this age of enlightenment, we find that there is a great deal about it that does not seem at all rational. Consider the French Revolution, undoubtedly the zenith of rationalism, so-called. It was based upon a deliberate intellectual rejection of the Orthodox religion of France, Catholicism, and unorthodox religious ideologies as defined by the French tradition and or law, such as Protestantism and Judaism, and the monarchy that claimed to rule by divine right, yet it resulted not from a thoughtful, plotting, intellectual appeal to the masses, but from an emotional, knee-jerk reaction to the excesses and corruptions of the monarchy and clergy. When the mob stormed the Bastille, that was not a rational action. Likewise, when Robespierre instigated the reign of terror and instituted the new artificial civic religion through dictatorial power, those were not rational actions. Revolutions, whether French or American or otherwise, while possibly being conceived intellectually, are invariably carried out irrationally. Thus, it should not be surprising that the Declaration, which was conceived by rational thought, relies upon irrational, primitive ideas, such as beginning with an acknowledgement of a Creator God and ending with an appeal for the deity's protection and providence. The founders' interpretation of natural law, natural rights, self-evident truths, and unalienable rights came mainly from John Locke's philosophical musings, of course, but it came more precisely from a combination primarily of Locke and his many disciples, like Isaac Newton's scientific formulations, William Black's political commentaries, and Scottish Enlightenment's religious skepticism. The first three sources mentioned here were distinctly Christian in orientation. Hamilton Long has proffered that everywhere one reads the phrase, quote, unalienable rights, end quote, in writings or speeches of the founders, it should be interpreted as, quote, God-given rights, because the only basis for considering them to be unalienable is the fundamental and uniquely American concept of their origin, that man possesses them solely by reason of endowment by his Creator, end quote. And it goes on to talk about the Constitution and all. But it's kind of late, so I guess I just show off some books that I got. I got this one, The American Founding, Its Intellectual and Moral Framework, right? It's like that. It's edited by Daniel Robinson and Richard Williams. It's got different contributors. Trying to see what like the first chapter is natural law, God and human dignity. And the second chapter is the Jewish and Christian principles of the founders. The third one is the classical roots of the American founding. Fourth chapter is the universal principles of the American founding. 5, city as a teacher. And 6, the founders' conception of education for civic life. 7, constitutionalism and its presuppositions. So it's kind of a slim book. And then I have the other one. It's called The Jewish Roots of American Liberty by Wilfred M. McClay and Stuart Halpern. This is the impact of Hebraic ideas on the American story. It looks like this, right? And it has different contributors as well. Like the first part, like has a first part, second part, and a third part, a fourth part as well. So it has 4 parts. Has a preface. That's the first chapter. It says, why we teach American history in faith-based schools. And part 1 is the influence of the Hebrew Bible on the American founding. Chapter 2 goes over John Milton, breaker of chains. And chapter 3 is the Judeo-Christian tradition and the rise of American religious liberty. Chapter 4, the Hebrew Bible and the political culture of the American founding. Chapter 4, right? Chapter 5 is the Hebraically inspired Liberty Bell and its role in the American story. Chapter 6 is Psalms and the American founding. And it has a part 2, right? It's, the influences of the Hebrew Bible on American culture. Chapter 7, the Shepherd of American courage. Chapter 8, Ezer in America. Chapter 9, American Samson. Chapter 10, America's Favorite Prophet. Chapter 11, Why Everyone Loves Daniel. Chapter 12, Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Hebraic Strain in American Thought. Chapter 13, The Story of Hagar and American Exile. And as a part 3 in his American Presidents Appreciation of Jewish Contributions. Chapter 14, The Bible and the Presidents. Chapter 15, Correspondence between Hebrew Congregations and George Washington. Chapter 16, Abraham Lincoln's Biblical Meditation in the Second Inaugural Address. Chapter 17, President Roosevelt and Vice President Fairbanks to attendees of the exercises in celebration of the 250th anniversary of Jewish settlement in America. Chapter 18, Jewish contributions to American democracy. And part 4 is the meaning of Jewish history for Americans, and it's got like chapter 19, why study American Jewish history. Chapter 20, what Jews mean to America, and chapter 21, the message from Jerusalem. So it's very interesting. So I brought this one, right? Because I want to keep America within its covenantal ethos, right? And I found this one, Protestantism and the American Founding. And this is edited by Thomas S. Engman, Michael P. Suckert. And this one also has many contributors as well. Has 9 chapters. It just has introduction, right? In chapter 1, natural rights and the Protestant politics. Chapter 2, religion and American values. Chapter 3, Protestantism and democracy in America. Chapter 4, the godless constitution. Chapter 5, Protestant prudence and a natural rights republic. Chapter 6, religion, philosophy, and the American founding. Chapter 7, the transformation of Protestant theology as a condition of the American Revolution. Chapter 8, the contingencies of the Christian republicanism, an alternative account of Protestantism and the American founding. Chapter 9, natural rights and Protestant politics, a restatement. And, sorry, I'm getting late. This one is from Tidendale to Madison, The History of Religious Liberty by Michael Ferris. This is what it looks like. Just goes over religious history and stuff. Like, yeah, the Baptists and Calvin and all this other stuff, and Catholic monarchy, and then William Tyndale, and then James Madison. This one's called The Bible, Science, and the Battle for America's Soul by John G. West. It looks like this. And goes over the Declaration, the scientific stuff, and the Bible, science, and the battle for American soul. It goes over America's creed, and we hold these truths, and a second American Revolution, then the triumph of scientocracy, and then Back to the Future. And the last chapter is where do we go from here? Anyway, I think for now I'll just go over those, right? So yeah, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.